First up on the show, the Israeli Defense Forces are pushing further into the Gaza city on a day when the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel to meet Prime Minister Netanyahu. Blinken's visit aims to not only show support to Israel in its ongoing war, but also take up the issue of civilian casualties in Gaza. And according to Hamas, the death toll in Gaza has now crossed the 9,200 mark as Israel continues its onslaught in the region. Now, before departing for Israel, Blinken said discussions will focus on Gaza getting more humanitarian aid and ways to ensure the conflict does not spread further into the region.
We will be talking about concrete steps that can and should be taken to minimize harm to men, women, and children in Gaza. And this is something that the United States is committed to. I'm not going to get into the details here, but it's very much on the agenda.
On his arrival, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the war cabinet in Tel Aviv. He also met the Israeli president, urging Palestinians to flee to safe zones. Incidentally, the White House has dismissed calls from Arab and several other nations for a full ceasefire in the war, while pressing for humanitarian pauses. His visit to Israel comes as the United States House of Representatives passed a bill to give Israel almost $15 billion in aid. A Republican-initiated proposal, President Joe Biden has promised a veto should make it through the Congress. Meanwhile, Israel's military has said it has completed the encirclement of Gaza's largest city, claiming it has killed the Hamas commander Mustafa Dalul during one of their aerial assaults and recovered arms and ammunition during searches in the Beit Hanun area. Thousands of cross-border Gazan workers and laborers in Israel and the occupied West Bank were sent back to Gaza. Some of the Gazan workers returned through the Kerem Shalom crossing. They claim to have been detained and ill-treated by Israeli authorities after the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel. Now, condemning Israel's actions to send Palestinian workers back to Gaza, United Nations said that it was deeply concerned about the 4,000 Palestinian workers and hospital patients who were detained and sent back to Gaza despite the gravity of the situation there.
First of all, we were very concerned that at least 4,000 Palestinian workers and hospital patients were detained without sufficient legal basis in military facilities after Israel revoked their permits. But then, as you said, there are worrying reports that some are being sent back into Gaza despite the gravity of the situation there.
Meanwhile, after dozens of pictures and video clips emerged over the past week showing IDF soldiers abusing and humiliating Palestinians apprehended in the West Bank, Israeli Defense Forces said that they have started investigating the alleged abuses by their soldiers. After a total blockade of Gaza for more than 3 weeks, the foreign passport holders and some wounded were allowed to leave through the Gaza crossing. Yesterday, 400 foreign citizens and wounded Gazans left for Egypt after some 320 on Wednesday. Dozens of critically injured Palestinians were allowed to cross as well. And well, earlier in the day, I spoke to David Dunn, Professor of International Politics, University of Birmingham, on this broadcast. And I began by asking him what can we expect from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's third visit to West Asia.
Well, he's clearly very keen to establish a series of pauses, not a ceasefire, but a series of pauses in the Israeli military operations to allow the evacuation of the wounded and other civilians, and also to allow humanitarian aid to cross the southern border. But he's also there to be seen to be there. It's important in American domestic politics. It's also important in the way in which American allies in the Middle East view things, that the American Secretary of State has to be seen to go the extra mile, to go to Israel and to press them for these pauses. But I expect also that he will be, when he goes to Jordan, he will be asking there whether there's anything they can do to take perhaps refugees from Gaza to allow them to evacuate a space that is clearly unsafe.
Professor Dunn, many believe that the US is giving out mixed signals on the war, giving Israel billions of dollars in aid and weaponizing the war, and then asking for a humanitarian pause.
So you're right in saying that this is an unequal fight in terms of the military capability on both sides. But there's two things to say on that. One is that the rate at which Israel is using bombs to drop them on Gaza, it will exhaust its supplies fairly quickly. But also, and importantly, America is giving defensive weapons, anti-aircraft weapons, anti-missile systems to Israel in order to try and deter the potential threat from Hezbollah in Lebanon, firing thousands of missiles that they have at Israel, or being able to defend against them if they do so. In terms of the line that America is following, it's a line which actually is also followed by the EU and by the UK and other parties, that Israel has a right to defend itself against the threat from Hamas. Hamas, of course, has repeated that their intention is to destroy Israel, to kill Jews, and to repeat the events of October 7 at every opportunity they get. Faced with that, Israel feels the need to try and eliminate Hamas, and the international community, by and large, is supportive of that right of self-defense. But of course, the international community is also calling for constraint, and that Israel does this in line with international humanitarian law and minimize the impact of civilians. That's the difficult thing to do, of course, how you actually operate in that space and achieve those objectives.
But there's certainly no domestic appetite for this war in the United States. Now, both Blinken and Biden have been heckled at briefings, while there are also real concerns that this war may open up multiple fronts.
So, yeah, two things. The domestic politics, this is a problem for the Biden administration. A lot of young Americans, a lot of young Democratic voting Americans are very critical of what Israel is doing in the way it is pursuing this war, and the huge number of civilian casualties that have been inflicted by the Israeli military action. So that is a problem for Biden, it's a problem for America, and it partly explains why I say that Blinken feels a need to be seen, to be actually coming here and pressing the Israeli forces for restraint. The other point of him being here, Blinken that is, in the region, is that there remains that risk of escalation. The speculation that Blinken would go to Turkey. If he went to Turkey, why would he be going there? Possibly to actually ask the Turkish government for permission to use the big American air bases there to attack Lebanon if the war should escalate and Lebanon starts to fire the hundreds of thousands of missiles that they have pointed to Israel in that direction. So there are concerns that this can escalate, and the American diplomacy is first and foremost focused on trying to keep the operation contained, while at the same time to actually be seen to be trying to get the Israelis to allow at least pauses in the military action.
Well, Professor David Dunn there speaking to WION.